Hello, lovely to see you here. Thanks for tuning in. This is the Delicious Legacy Podcast, and I'm your host, Thomas Dinas. Welcome back to another archaeogastronomical adventure. This is part 2 of our exploration of the Chinese cuisine, an interview I did last week with the historian and professor Thomas DuBois, and also author of a new book, China in 7 Banquets, a flavorful history, out now by Reaction Books. One thing that we didn't really cover in the interview with Thomas is that soya is very popular, obviously, in China. And this popularization of soya, it's quite old. It's a very important plant and food for the Chinese subcontinent, let's say. There's a legend about its discovery. One tells the tale of 2 bandits, warlords Yu Xiong and Gong Gangxi, lost in the desert, who managed to survive on beans of a hitherto unknown plant. According to an 18th century Chinese encyclopedia, this happened very long ago. Under the Ming emperors in 1595, Li Shizhen devoted a section to soya in his treatise on botany and the medicinal properties of plants, what we can translate in English as the great shame of all plants. Perhaps, if I don't pronounce it badly, Benkao Gangmu. But we have to go back to the 6th century BCE, so about 2,500 years ago, to find the first written mention of soya in the court poems of the Book of Odes, a text full of information on many subjects. It states that the wild soya plant came from northern China and began to be cultivated in the Chang period, around the 15th century BCE apparently. The archaic ideogram Su, used to denote the plant itself, used to denote the plant is itself a lesson in agriculture. There's a row of little marks at the base of the character, said to represent the roots of the plant. Why go to all the trouble of sowing them? Because the roots of the soya, even more than those of other plants, other leguminous plants, are able to nourish the soil. The nodules they bear are storehouses of nitrogenous bacteria, which they spread as the roots rot. Growing soya, therefore, is a way of replenishing the soil, a soil impoverished by such greedy plants as wheat, for example, and it also can be regarded as a green manure crop. This useful property of soya, one that was recognized very early in Chinese history, it's not obviously the only virtue of it. In fact, it could be described in the ornate Chinese fashion as a treasure house of life. It contains, obviously, balanced in ideal proportions, all the things that we need to sustain life. Proteins, fats, carbohydrates, vitamins and mineral salts. And then it's easy to appreciate its importance in the countries of Far East. Of course, from soya beans, we know that the very popular soy sauce is produced, and also tofu and all these delicacies of China that have been relatively recently only exported to the rest of the world, or at least to us in Europe and North America, let's say. The Chinese Buddhist missionaries of the 6th century who reached Japan through Korea, they brought only not religious message, but this plant as well. And that became a staple of the Japanese diet from there onwards, in the same way that Buddhism in a way merged with the native religion of Shinto. And Japan also became a big advocate of soya and soy sauce and soybeans and all that stuff. It seems that the Portuguese and the Dutch sailors who traded with China and Japan very early on in the end of the 15th century, were not unacquainted with soya. They mention it in the travel writings, but always with indifference at a time when Europe was experiencing its own waves of famines periodically. So it's quite interesting that it hasn't been adopted that far back from us, from the Europeans, although we knew about it. Well, not me personally, I wasn't alive, but yeah, the traders. Soy sauce, obviously, it's Chinese in origin, and before soy became popular, until the 5th century, the Chinese made a paste they call jiang, which they used fish puree. And at the time of the Han Dynasty, in the 3rd century, soya paste became the standard ingredient, replacing a mixture of firstly fruits and then cereals, and so on. The Italian Gemelli Carreri, which he followed the steps of Marco Polo in around the end of the 17th century, gives an account of meals consisting entirely of soya, which he ate in the modern Beijing or Peking area. And he says, quote, "They ate pieces of boiled paste, delicately sliced, and a soup of beans called tan fu, which is one of their most delicious dishes, for they dip their food into it. It is made of small skinned white beans." China and Chinese people are very fond of carp as well, and still very popular there too. But it was always something they loved, and they bred and they invented a method of mixed stock rearing, which began like perhaps even 3,000 years ago. So yeah, it has been their favorite fish for 30 centuries. So the Chinese name for carp is Li, which is also a common surname in China too. So the first piscicultural treatise in the world was written by a Chinese in 1473 BCE. The author name was Fan Li. In a twist of fate, that common patronymic was the name of a number of emperors of the famous Tang dynasty, and because it appeared inappropriate to eat so sacred a totem, and the carp respectfully disappeared from menus for 3 centuries. But when a new dynasty came into power, things changed again, and carp was back on the menu. One of the oldest recipes in the world for a Chinese fish salad, yokai, appears in the Correct Principles of Eating and Drinking by the imperial dietitian Hu Shihui. The work was written in 1330 BC, most likely, and is mentioned in texts going back to the Chu dynasty, which flourished in the 11th century BC. This salad consisted of slices of raw carp, marinated in a mixture of radish, ginger, chives, basil, and peppered knotgrass. I love the mythical origins of food as well. And I want to read a couple of short passages from the book of the professor. So one is about the invention of agriculture. So folk tales attributed the invention of agriculture to a mythical figure known as Shenong, the divine farmer. It was him who taught primitive humans how to plant, harvest, and store grain. In order to know which wild plants were edible and helpful, Shenong went out and tried each one. Shenong invented the plough, the calendar, and medicine. In a fundamental way, Shenong marked the beginning of everything. He remains an important figure in folk religion, especially among farmers. Wheat, which is better flavored and above all better for bread making than millet, is a plant for dry soils, and one of the many remarkable feats of the Chinese people was their eventual success in growing it. Wheat came to China around the 4th century BC, undoubtedly by the same route as Alexander the Great, and neither North China, which is very cold, nor South China, which is very hot, seemed naturally suited to it. In the end, the southern part of the country turned to rice. The severe winter climate of North China and the humidity of its brief summers made it suitable only for soft spring-sown wheat, a hybrid of the Greco-Roman period. Chinese ingenuity soon solved the problem of sowing in soil still hard from the winter. The Fang Sheng Shishu, an agricultural treatise of the 1st century BC, recommends soaking the seed corn overnight in a light mash made of peas and the excrement of silkworms, before sowing it at dawn so that the gruel and the dew moisten the ground together. For a long time to come, quantities of millet were the standard measures of volume. Later generations would hold up Confucius himself as a paragon of correct eating habits. Neither a glutton nor ascetic, Confucius' dining habits were portrayed as having been above reproach, indicating respect to heaven and gratitude for the bounty of the earth. He is shown eating simply and deliberately, avoiding rich tastes but having a special fondness for ginger. He refused the hospitality of a prince who offended him, but gladly shared the humbler table of a poor village host who understood the value of propriety. Another thing that we didn't really cover is alcohol. And alcohol was, in fact, very much a fundamental part of the ancient Chinese society. We have various, obviously, evidence about it, and the earliest evidence of brewing comes not from the records themselves, historical records, but from archaeological finds. And archaeologists that found pottery from Neolithic sites suspected that it's been used for brewing. Recent finds of 5,000 old brewing kits consisting of a pottery stove, funnel and fermenting jars, complete with residue that confirms the recipe. Broomcorn millet, barley, job steers and various tubers. Job steers is also known as Adley millet and is a tall grain-bearing perennial tropical plant, and it's a native to Southeast Asia. That was introduced to northern China and India in remote antiquity and elsewhere cultivated in gardens as an annual. Other sites reveal fruit wine, basically, made from honey, peaches, plums and dates, as well as medicinal recipes. We have that contain sweet clover and jasmine and hemp. And because obviously these ancient methods of brewing, they're not precisely known, we assume that there must have been a few different ways to create alcoholic drinks, all of these fruit wines at the same time. If we see around Asia at the moment and through history, there are many different ways to make the grain ferment, and then this germinated grain will actually start to produce some alcohol for us. A writer from the 4th century recorded a process that by that time was already thousands years old. Mix ground rice and assorted grass and leaves together with the juice of the kop plant. Make the dough as large as an egg, put it in the shade of reeds for a month and it will become ferment. Then mix this ferment with rice and produce wine. Again, another short passage from the book goes like this. This description of ceremonial drinking protocol between friends comes from Etiquette and Rites, one of the 3 key Confucian ritual texts. The host and the guest salute each other 3 times. When they reach the steps, they concede to each other 3 times. Then the host ascends. The guest also ascends. The host stands under the lintel, faces north and salutes twice. The guest ascends from the west of the steps, stands under the lintel, faces north and returns the salutation. The host sits down and takes the dewy cup from the tray and descends to wash. Guest follows host. The host sits down again and pronounces words of courtesy, and the guest replies. Contrasts the importance of wine with the official contempt for drunkenness. Having overthrown the Shang, the Zhou kingdom gleefully took every chance to badmouth the drunken predecessors, especially the final Shang king. He was obsessed with drinking and refused to refrain from pleasure. He had a perverse and cruel heart with no fear of death. He behaved badly at Yin, which was the Shang's capital, and cared not about its fall. No fragrant sacrifices ascended to heaven, only the people's grievances and the rank odor of the drunken officials. Thus, heaven showed no love for Yin and sent down destruction. This quote comes from the Zhu's own restrictions on drink. Later commenters suggested that the elaborate drink rituals were not intended to ban alcohol altogether, but rather to imbue drinking with a sense of formality, claiming somewhat unrealistically that paying close attention to ritual slowed the pace of consumption and allowed everyone involved to drink all day without losing control. But so much for theory. In fact, China's early drinking culture was widely pervasive. Confucius himself was said to enjoy his drink, but not to the point of excess. Others openly sought out the freedom of inebriation. Folk poems collected in the Book of Songs place feasting and drinking on the same plane and revel in wine as a celebration of life and friendship and a balm to soothe the pain of loss and longing. First century writer Zhu Sen captures this dual nature in his pan-heavy definition of wine. Alcohol, Zhu, means to achieve, Zhu. It is what brings out the good and evil in human nature. It also means to produce, since it is what produces good and bad fortune. In ancient times, Yi Di invented unfiltered ale. King Yu tasted it and found it excellent. Then he exiled Yi Di. And that's from the book of Professor Thomas DuBois. Some interesting cooking techniques and dishes of early China. We have spit roasting, which obviously is a technique that was used for beef, pork, sheep, and fish. And this form of roasting displaced an earlier method called pao, a technique that cooked the meat, the animal inside its own skin, and while that's happening, the fur was burning off, and you could get rid of it. Then there is something called geng, which was more like soup or a stew with or without the associated vegetables that we have with stews or grains themselves. So it could be either. And the character for hai was composed of a hand, a dish, and a jar. And this is something similar to, as we discussed in the episode with Roman garum or Thai fish sauce as well. It was a paste made by pickling, fermenting dried meat in a sense, with a grain starter. And this was used as a food. And also the liquid known as tan was valued as a condiment. A process of how to make hai has been recorded from the 2nd century writer Zheng Xuan, and it goes like this: basically, dry the meat and then cut it in fine pieces, mix it with grain and the starter and the salt, soak it in fine wine, close the jar, and it will be ready after 100 days. And it seems to be like an ancestor of bean pastes that we have today in China, in Chinese cuisine. And the later recipe for pao, that roast meat method, is the following. Remove all internal organs of a young pig or a young lamb and fill the cavity with jujubes. This is a fruit native to China. Wrap the animal with reeds, encase it in clay, and roast it over an open fire. Once the clay is completely dry, break it off, and then with wet hands peel the charred skin. Slather a paste of rice flour on the outside and fry in melted fat, deep enough to cover the whole animal. After it has been fried, remove and cut into slices. Prepare the seasonings and place into a bronze ding vessel, which is immersed into a large pot of water. Simmer for 3 days and nights and serve with hai and vinegar pickles. Okay, and with that, let's go to the part 2 of our interview with Thomas DuBois. So, where do we go from here? What's our next step in our adventure?
One of the areas that I wanted to bring to culinary history was real history, world history, and in particular business history, which is another area that I've written for. And that's where you really see, I think the 20th century is very misunderstood. When we talk about, for example, Chinese migrants going to Peru or going to Australia and making their own cuisine, we only ask one question: is it real? Is it authentic? And that's not the question. That's not the right question. The right question is, how does a cuisine, how does a way of eating adapt to, or how do people change their way of eating in response to the new opportunities that they face? So, for example, how do you live? How do people live? Do they live in an apartment building? Do they live in a communal setting, like in the 1950s when we had the rise of the people's communes? People did not cook at home because everybody was cooking in these giant communes that had about 40,000 people living in them. What does that do? When you have a period of time that Home kitchens have disappeared.
Yeah.
When you have, for example, women joining the workforce, this is a thing that happened. What did it do to culinary expertise? If the carrier of culinary expertise is grandma, and grandma spent her whole life before she became grandma in, say, a textile factory, what does that do to a country's culinary tradition? So I think very often when we look at culinary history, we want to see the big picture of long-term change over the ancient or the distant past.
Yeah.
The changes of the past 10 years in China are easily as profound as 300 years of the Middle Ages.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one thing that we historians can really focus on with laser point precision because the sources are all right there. And that's something that nobody has done.
Interesting. Obviously, 20th century, it's been very tumultuous for China. Well, for everybody. But I mean,
For everybody.
Yeah, there's so much there. Changes fundamentally, and especially accelerates after 1978. Is it?
It's just something very simple. Branding. Branding comes from somewhere. And when you have branded products, they're sold or franchising. They're sold in a certain way. They're advertised in a certain way. They're produced in a certain way. This has fundamentally changed everything we know.
Yeah.
As cooks, as diners, everything we know about food has been transformed. Even in the past 5 years, before and after, certainly something like COVID.
Yeah.
Profound impact on the everyday eating habits of hundreds of millions of people.
Yeah, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're not just talking about China, but I think worldwide we have these trends, these profound trends. At least I find that way, that the last 5, maybe 10 years, you can see this acceleration in food, how the food culture changes, basically. And you can see that in real terms in China, even more so, because the acceleration, the way of things changing over the past 10 years has been like 10 times.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it used to be maybe 20, 30 years ago, we would look at, you'd look at Japan and say, oh, that's China in half a century. Now I think China is increasingly the trendsetter. So we can look at, things like home delivery of food or huge scale production of something like milk, at these giant dairies out in Inner Mongolia, and say, now that may be the future of the world.
Milk features a lot, especially on the beginning of your book, basically as an example of a product, a commodity, and a food that drives and is driven by innovation and technology. And then demand comes with that, which is very interesting and I think it speaks a lot about not just milk, but a lot of products and a lot about globalization and how it's driven. I suppose it's driven now by China rather than any other country, more from China than other countries. And also, if I go back to the past, was it milk or cheese or dairy products something that was thought as a specialty product, something that the wealthy had, or it wasn't popular at all as a food in China?
It went through waves. Mm-hmm. It went through very distinct waves because it's really kind of an ethnicized way of eating. Mm-hmm. The people who would be consuming dairy, and it's really not milk. That's the first thing to say, because milk only lasts, half a day.
Yeah.
It's somehow preserved into yogurt or cheese or whatnot. And there are a lot of different ways of talking about this, but it's an ethnicized way of eating because it's generally pastoral in origin. So it's, China historically would have people come in from the West, from the North, and they would either be trading or invading. But, the pastoral influence came and went. It ebbed and flowed. The other big influence about milk is Buddhism, because a lot of the customs that came in from Central Asia came in with Buddhism, and a lot of the knowledge as well. So Indian medicine, South Asian, all kinds of technologies, they came in with Buddhism around the year 0, roughly, is when it really started to make an impact. And milk or dairy or butter have a strong symbolic value in Buddhist scriptures. So if you have people that are vegetarian, in many cases, they are consuming dairy, but they're not consuming meat. And then butter it appears in Buddhist scriptures. Milk appears in Buddhist scriptures. So Buddhist culture came in and brought dairy consumption with it. And it's not the kind of thing you would expect to be a big carrier of food culture, but absolutely it was. So at times, dairy was either commonplace or commonplace among certain people. So again, the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols, are a very good example of this. They maintained a very clear ethnic separation from the people that they ruled, and they were heavy consumers of dairy. But that doesn't mean that the rest of China was.
Okay. Makes sense. Yeah. I'll be back after this short break. Yeah, I suppose cheese is not something we associate with Chinese food at all. Yeah.
Well, now we do.
Now we do. Tell us a little bit about that.
China is now the world's largest consumer of dairy.
That's mind-blowing.
That's mind-blowing, yes. When I first came here in the early 1990s, you could not get milk to save your life. Mm-hmm. I don't know what scenario there would be that you need milk to save your life, but if that scenario came up, you were out of luck.
Yeah.
You could get powdered milk, but you could not get fresh milk. And then just, I would watch this because I'm a heavy coffee drinker, so I know where my milk is coming from. You would watch just every year, there would be some technological innovation that would either make dairy more available or more easy to transport or cheaper or better tasting or what have you. And witnessing that technological innovation pick up speed was also something that I'm really grateful that I got to be here on the ground to see that. There's also political influence because sometime around the year 2000, the government decided that it wanted to promote milk consumption. And so from an export industry, it became a domestic industry. And, now milk is everywhere. It truly is everywhere in China. There, you can go to the most remote place in the country and it won't be fresh milk, but there will be powdered milk. And there will be every dessert you can get, every packaged or fresh made cake or pudding or what have you, all has powdered milk. It's
Wow.
just that fundamental to the cuisine these days.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you see that change in real life in front of your eyes. I mean, I kind of lived through these phases occasionally, or I heard from my parents, my grandparents, the powdered milk. Or this. So you see the slow advance of how things evolve in a country like Greece, going through a process of industrialization, let's say, and, all that stuff happening slowly. And here you have it accelerated, and you live it through year by year, and you can document it in minute detail, I think. And it's very fascinating for a historian. And you can see how the flavors change as well, right? And the tastes.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one example is powdered milk. You have to dissolve it in hot water. So people, when they did consume milk, when they drank milk, they would put it into their oatmeal. They wouldn't drink it as a glass of milk. You would eat it or drink it hot. So, it's not something you pull out of the refrigerator. It's something you pull out of the kettle of hot water. UHT packed milk, in the little Tetra Pak cartons, doesn't taste very good. So if you want to make it appeal to children, you have to add lots of sugar. So, I have a little bottle right in front of me of a really famous brand called Wahaha, and they have a product called Children's Milk, and this is a nostalgia drink,
right?
And it's basically reconstituted milk powder, really, really sweet. Anybody about the age of 40 in China will go crazy for this because this is the taste of their childhood. If you give it to a child now, this is terrible. This is disgusting. This does not taste right. But somebody who grew up with that being the treat if you did well on a test, right. You get a can of this stuff. This is just the finest taste in the world. The taste follows the technology, and that technology is very clearly generational.
What do you see now as food trends in China? And in your book, basically, because you describe now and the future, what do we see we're going from here?
I'm not optimistic in many ways. I am optimistic about a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
What am I optimistic about? China has a huge emphasis on food security.
Mm-hmm.
And this is because the communist government came from a guerrilla war setting. And so since its founding, they have really strongly emphasized that every place has to be prepared in the basics of grain. We're not going to let ourselves get starved out. Even before this, grain security was about as fundamental a concern as you could get. For the Qing dynasty or the Ming dynasty, they had all of these policies in place to make sure that people did not starve. So grain security and food security, generally speaking, and that food security would mean things like food safety. It would mean, now we're not just saying, do people have enough grain to eat, but do we have enough pork to eat? Do we have enough vegetables? This is seen not as the concern of the market. This is the concern of the state in China. And for the most part, they're doing a very good job with that. So where am I optimistic? Food chains are going to be secure, and food is generally, I think, going to become more plentiful, more safe, and cheaper. Mm-hmm. That's where I'm optimistic. Where I am pessimistic is that when these cold chains get more efficient, they also, I'm obviously from the United States. This is something we learned too well in the United States. Food is very cheap in the US compared to Europe, but it's not good. In many cases. And I don't mean that we don't know how to cook. I mean that the quality of food you can get from the supermarket at this low price might not be very good.
Yeah.
Because it's these very large scale chains, these very, mass production is oriented towards efficiency, cheapness, and uniformity of product. And the charm of local food is sacrificed on the altar of efficiency. And we're not even talking about something like nutrition. Is this food wholesome? Does it have pesticides? Does it have antibiotics or whatnot? That's another question altogether. But culinarily, this is something that I have seen since, again, the early 90s, that local food gets steamrolled.
Right.
If you can pop down to from where I am in Beijing, food is either the collection of convenience stores, so everything packaged and very salty and very bad for you, or delivery. And delivery is the same food but made in a central kitchen.
Right.
And that's the future. That's the future because that is where that's where the money is to be made.
Right.
Restaurants have razor thin profit margins. And if you can change your kitchen, if you can go from a 10-person kitchen to a 1-person kitchen, you will do it. And if you can go from a full stove to a bunch of microwaves, you'll do that too. And so, the competition is so fierce that the result is not going to be better food. The result is going to be cheaper food.
I see. Yeah.
And I'm fairly sure that is what's going to happen, because once the financial interests are clear, there really is just no way to stop that.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, it's not.
I'm not optimistic about that. There will always be sort of craft producers, and there will always be live kitchens, but the forces pushing for uniformity. Even just I just got back from Chengdu in Sichuan, and I was there a few years ago, so before and after COVID, and you can see how much, even in a food city like Chengdu, how much and how quickly these forces, they transform the market, and then they transform people's expectations. And that's where, when I just got there, I was taken by a friend to a restaurant, and we had a dinner that was just terrible. And the friend was very happy with this food.
Right.
And she's local. And I just thought, now, it's one thing for a restaurant to serve bad food. It's another thing altogether for you to say, good. That's where the tragedy lies.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's something I never thought about. Yeah. Yeah, it's not a very optimistic note, is it?
I should be an optimist. I mean, it makes for a better podcast, but
it's all right. It's fine. So that's a couple of things through this huge adventure of through thousands of years. Can we talk a little bit about the tea, the history of tea in China? Do you have any? How did it come about, and how it became so popular?
Well, tea has always been there.
Mm-hmm.
Tea is one of these, like Sichuan peppercorn or ginger. It's native, and it comes from the earliest is from Sichuan in the southwest. So it's a very good tea growing area. And tea is like milk in that it was associated with Buddhism. And in the Tang Dynasty or slightly before, tea became, first of all, the tea that you would have had at that time was certainly not with sugar. It would have been with orange peel or with salt, other kinds of spices. But the culture of tea is something that grew up around the Tang Dynasty, which is when Buddhism really took over, a little bit earlier than that, but when China really became a Buddhist country. And at that time, Buddhist monasteries were really great centers of culture and learning and art and science. And they were, in a way, sort of the champions of tea. And so tea was not just a drink, it was a lifestyle. And there was a book called The Book of Tea, the Cha Jing, that in very poetic terms explained how do you appreciate tea and how do you make tea part of a cultured life. And the cultured life was especially the culture of the kind of the reclusive hermit, the poetic hermit.
Right.
So tea took on a very romantic image during that time, and it has kept it. And it's changed. You have different people who started drinking tea in different markets for tea. Later than this, these pastoral people in the north, if you're pastoral, you generally don't have a lot of time to keep a garden. And so the diet is entirely based on animals, with the exception of tea. That's why you associate tea drinking with Mongolia, Central Asia, Russia, these grass, these steppe areas. And that became one of the most consistent and lucrative trade routes for hundreds and hundreds of years, is that places that produced livestock would send their livestock in to central China, and in return, you would send them back tea. This was one of the big economic conveyor belts of East Asia.
Interesting, very interesting. And tea, you said in the beginning, at least, was drunk. Was it like infused with other spices, and it was like no milk, obviously no sugar, but just spices? And
I don't know about. I think I don't know if there was ever a custom of drinking it with butter, but I mean, in Mongolia today, you would have milk tea.
Yeah,
and this is a brewed, not the kind of milk tea that you would get with the little tapioca bubbles. That's that's something else. But milk tea would be fermented tea, like pu'er tea, so brick tea. That's how brick tea is meant to be drunk, is with milk. And you would brew it, so you would boil the milk with the brick tea, and then add. You could sweeten it. I've seen that. You could add something called chaomi, it looks like millet. Just a little sort of crunchy thing to go into the tea. But that is the daily staple of traditional pastoral Mongols.
Yeah, brilliant. And finally, to close this interview, could you? I know it's going to be a very difficult question, but could you give us the favorite recipes of you from the past? Like, if you can expand in one recipe that you think we should all try it, maybe, or something that you really think it's unique from ancient China, for example, or something.
Okay, I have one recipe that I have spent a lot of time on, and actually, this one comes from literature, and it is from a book called The Dream of the Red Chamber, the 红楼梦. And people say it's, sort of there are people who say it's the greatest novel ever written. It is from the 1800s, so the high imperial cuisine, and it's a wealthy family. So the Dream of the Red Mansion is another way to translate it. They live in this giant compound. And in this one scene in this book, there is a dish called qie and qie and it's something that is part of the plot because it's a dish that the rich family serves to their poor relatives. And there are two ways of making it. Basically, it's an eggplant dish, and the eggplant is cut fine and then dried. And then in one version, it's just cooked with some vegetables. In another version, it's steamed over a chicken broth. So you would boil this chicken, has to be an old hen, and then steam the dried eggplant over that. It's supposed to take all of the taste of the chicken when you steam it. So you do that not one time, you do it 10 times. So the idea is that this one dish of chicken or this one dish of eggplant, requires like days of labor.
Right.
10 chickens. And I tried it. And I can say, because there are two different versions, and one of them is considered to be sort of more authoritative, but which one do you choose? Not that one. Because if you steam and dry eggplant 10 times, it will fall apart. And that's what happened with mine. But that is one of those dishes that I think anybody who has read that book is going to remember. And a lot of people have tried it. And this is one thing that's really interesting about writing this in China is the Chinese version is coming out really soon. And I think it's going to find a lot of readers because recreating historical recipes is a really big thing in China. And you make the recipe and you put it online, it goes on your social media and whatnot. So I think these recipes are really interesting. And this is probably, of all these historical recipes, this is the one that everybody wants to try because it sounds so elaborate. And I will tell you, it is, it's days of work. and it just isn't that good when you're done. To be honest, it's just not worth it.
All in the name of research, yeah.
All in the name of research.
Yeah.
The other ones have been much more successful.
Great. I'm glad to know, because you have, as you said, you have about 80 recipes in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, something like that. And there's some really good ones that really made me, I need to try this and I need to sort of make it. And also, we haven't touched like 1/10 or 1/20 of what you have in the book, information and history and detail. It's fascinating and so detailed. And you also have references from the past where you found all these recipes and texts, so people can look on that as well if they buy your book and want to read more stuff.
Yeah. It's got all of the sources that I used. Some of them, if you translate the name into English, it might be a little bit hard to find the Chinese original, but the Chinese version is coming out soon.
Yeah.
So if you speak Chinese well enough to want the Chinese original, I've got a book for you.
And you also have references for measurements, weights and measurements. So there's a difference on that as well. So there's a lot of, if someone wants to immerse themselves into Chinese food culture and culinary history, your book is something that they should buy. China in 7 Banquets. And finally, what do you stand about the rumor we have in a lot of in the West about Marco Polo bringing noodles or pasta to the West?
This is why I'm glad I started with business history, because I know where that myth came from. It was actually from the 1920s, and American Pasta Company came up with that. It is not true. What is probably true is that a certain kind of pasta, pressed pasta, probably came to Europe from the Arab world.
Yeah.
But before that, who knows? And of course, pasta came to China from somewhere.
Yeah.
China didn't invent it.
Absolutely. Great. Good good you have this information, because that's what I know as well. Like it's kind of invented in different places at the same time or earlier, later.
Exactly.
So, yeah, it's something that people did. And yeah, I mean, in Persia as well, in ancient Iran, they ate pasta as well. So it's kind of...
Exactly.
It's everywhere. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Professor Thomas DuBois, thank you so much for coming into the Delicious Legacy podcast and give us some brief history of food in China and tell us where people can buy your book.
I think it's, you can get it from the Reaction webpage, Reaction with a K, or just from Amazon. And apparently people are buying it. So I'm very happy to hear about that.
Fantastic. Great. It's a great book. And I think it will make a great present for anyone interested in food or history or China or all three, basically. It's just a treasure. Thank you so much for your book and for coming to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, my ravenous archaeogastronomers, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on Acast, on Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you get your podcasts from. If you have any questions or any suggestions, please do get in touch. I love hearing from you. And you can get in touch. You can find me on Instagram as The Delicious Legacy, on Twitter or X as The Delicious Legacy again, and on Patreon. If you want to be members, you can find me there as The Delicious Legacy Podcast. So patreon.com, The Delicious Legacy Podcast, where you can become members from $3 a month, and you can support the podcast. And of course, you get bonus episodes, you get bonus content, you get it ad-free, and you get exclusive recipes as well. And basically, you help me cover the costs of creating the podcast. And I'll be very, very grateful to you as well. You can also email me and get in touch this way at thedeliciouslegacypodcast@gmail.com. One word, The Delicious Legacy Podcast, no underscores or anything else. So you can find me there. Do email me. I love hearing from people. And of course, if you cannot support monetary this way, you can also tell your friends and family and share it with 3 friends via any way that you do your podcasts. And even enemies, because enemies need to hear the podcast too. Love them or hate them. That'll teach them a lesson. So, that's it for today. Thanks for listening. I've been Thomas Dinas, and this was the Delicious Legacy Podcast. See you again next week for another archaeogastronomical adventure.